sí, sí. Sí, 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 sí.
Buenas tardes a todos. Para mí, en representación del señor decano, doctor Carlos Fonseca Zamora, y también de parte de la Escuela de Medicina, es un gusto tener el día de hoy al doctor Norman Campbell, que nos visita de la Universidad de Calgary, de Canadá, y que ahorita la doctora Blanco va a hacerle su presentación de quién tenemos aquí el día de hoy. Pues darle la bienvenida a él y también poder contar con este espacio para que lo escuchemos con su presentación sobre el control de la hipertensión a través de la reducción de sal en la dieta. Así que realmente para todos los compañeros de la ciencia que están aquí y también invitados de otros lugares, es un gusto tenerlos hoy. Entonces, sin más, le doy el momento, el espacio a la doctora Blanco para que le haga la presentación oficial. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, doctora. Buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Bueno, vamos a presentarles al doctor Norman Campbell. Él es médico internista general, es profesor en medicina, ciencias de la salud comunitaria, fisiología y farmacología. Es miembro del Instituto O'Brien de Salud Pública y del Instituto Cardiovascular Living de Alberta en la Universidad de Calgary, Canadá. Es miembro del Grupo Técnico Asesor de la Organización Panamericana de la Salud y de la Organización Mundial sobre Prevención de Enfermedades Cardiovasculares a través de la reducción de la sal dietética. El doctor Campbell tiene más de 400 publicaciones en revistas revisadas por pares, más de 450 presentaciones nacionales e internacionales y ha recibido varios reconocimientos por sus esfuerzos, incluida la Orden de Canadá en el 2014. Muchas gracias. Sin más, dejo al doctor Campbell con ustedes.
Hola. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today about higher. Yeah? Can you hear me okay? Yeah? I'll talk to you about dietary salt and its role in increasing blood pressure and causing other health risks. Now, just before my talk, I'll give you my conflicts of interest. Most of them are unpaid academic interests. I have worked with the Novartis Foundation on hypertension control in Mongolia for 2 years, and also was a consultant on the design of a medical examination bench, but have no commercial interests relating to food as such. Now, for today, I'm going to review some of the estimated disease burden from dietary salt, the mechanisms by which salt can cause disease, evidence for its impact on blood pressure in humans, and also cardiovascular disease, some of the sources of controversy, and I'm also going to try to get you interested in the area to become advocates for reducing salt in Costa Rica. Now, this is really close to the start of World Salt Week, and this is an advertisement from the American Heart Association that's very interested in the activity. But anyway, happy World Salt Week. Now, this is a declaration from the Pan American Health Organization, a expert panel which Dr. Blanca and myself were on in 2009 to 11, and it outlined what it thought academics and non-governmental organizations should do. Now, there is a declaration from PAHO, as there is from Costa Rica, which is very similar. And so academics and academic organizations should endorse and support that. Part of it calls on the memberships of these organizations to be educated on the health risks of high dietary salt, and I hope to help with that today, and how to reduce dietary salt, which I won't be really talking about, but to really encourage your involvement in advocacy, to promote presentations on dietary salt at national meetings and publications on dietary salt to help spread the information, to promote media releases to bring the information to the public, and in particular to children and to women who have integral roles in eating and family health. As a male, I would like to be included there too. Broadly disseminate relevant literature. It's important that we always assume that our policymakers and decision makers are well informed, but that's not always the case. We have a role to talk to them about the benefits of reducing dietary salt, and also to advocate for them to take appropriate actions with policies and regulations that would reduce salt. Increase our organizational capacity, and that may mean creating work groups or other such groups to promote action. Now, lastly, not part of PAHO, but I've been very concerned as I've worked in the area of nutrition for only about 12 years about all the nasty things that a few dissenting scientists do, and I think it's time that we actually have a formal investigation as to their conduct. Whether they are saying things that are truthful, to expose their conflicts of interest, closely examine their research methods, reproducibility of findings. So this now is on to the more content. This is data from the Global Burden of Disease study, and it's looking at the health risks for death worldwide. And, oops, excuse me. I apologize for the slides, but here you have high blood pressure. as the leading risk for death worldwide in this study, closely followed by dietary risks. I'm sorry about that. Here we are at the right slides. I'm sorry. Not seeing the top part of the one slide. Hypertension, the leading risk for death in the world, closely followed by dietary risks, both estimated to kill more than 10 million people. And so very big risks globally. When we break down the dietary risks, we see it's really a complex mix of vast excesses of calories, sodium, sugar, and saturated fats, as well as deficiencies. And we usually think of food as a source of health, but what has happened over the time period where we've changed from eating natural foods to eating processed foods, diets are now one of the leading risks for both death and disability globally. When we come down to Costa Rica, Costa Rica is a country in the world, and it essentially has the same issues and problems. Hypertension, by far the leading risk for death in Costa Rica, estimated to kill more than 4,000 people, and then followed by dietary risks. When we break down the dietary risks in Costa Rica, again, it's a complex mixture of things that are in excess in the diets as well as things that are deficient. And a high dietary sodium, again, being the third leading risk for death in Costa Rica, estimated to kill more than 500 Costa Ricans in the year 2016. Now, I come from Canada. In Canada, we talk about sodium in milligrams. Most of the rest of the world, including Costa Rica, talks about salt in grams. The World Health Organization, PAHO, and Costa Rica target is for adults to consume less than 5 grams of salt a day, which in Canadian terms is less than 2,000 milligrams. In Canada, we have slightly different targets, which are just below. Now, the Global Burden of Disease Study, which I just reviewed for you, estimates over 2 million deaths and over 45 million years of disability in 2016 as a result of too much salt in your diet. About a third of hypertension can be attributed to excess salt in your diet. That means there's about 400 million people globally with hypertension just as a result of too much salt in our food. World Health Organization estimates that reducing salt is one of the few most cost-effective ways to improve population health. They have something they call a best buy, and reducing dietary salt or sodium is one of the few best buys that they indicate to governments to take action on. Just reducing dietary salt by 15% in countries would save about 8.5 million lives in 10 years. When they compare this to tobacco reduction, another best buy, it's just slightly more cost effective than efforts to reduce tobacco intake, but it's not a competition. Both of those are highly advised interventions. You can see that in a more populous country north of you, in the United States, the cost savings are in the tens of billions of dollars, and the reduction in events are in the hundreds of thousands just by a relatively small reduction in dietary salt of about 3 grams. Now, one of the questions people always ask is how much salt do we need? And the truth is we don't actually have an answer to that. We've evolved on natural foods without added salt. It would be unethical to take salt out of those natural foods and see that when people start dying or are being disabled. What we do know is that if you eat natural foods and you're a vegetarian, you'd be consuming about 500 milligrams of sodium a day. If you eat meat as well as vegetables, you're at about the 700 to 800 milligrams of sodium a day. Long-term studies in humans where they do give them very low amounts of sodium down to 100 to 400 milligrams a day indicate normal body function is maintained. Now, in hunter-gatherer populations that are eating unprocessed foods, they are physically active and lean as well. Hypertension is very rare, and blood pressure does not increase with age. What that tells you is we've created hypertension as a risk and a disease, and most of it, about 80%, is explained on a dietary basis. In the old days, even before me, before they had medications to treat hypertension, they had some terrible diet called the Kumpner rice diet, and it could treat people with malignant hypertension and renal failure and lower their blood pressure to normal. And the main reason it did so was it had a very low amount of sodium in it. Now, you're all clinicians, and all of you will be aware that there are situations where more salt is required, people with diarrheal illnesses, hypotension, and other things. Here we're talking about a public health initiative in a healthy population. Now, in terms of the pathophysiology, it's important. There's a huge literature out there, tens of thousands of studies. We do a weekly update, and on a Medline search, there's about 100 articles a week that relate to salt and dietary sodium. So hard data to stay up to date with. In this slide, we're looking at some of the mechanisms of pathophysiology. We can see there's a variety of biomedical mechanisms where salt is increased in food, results in increased blood pressure, and this is true in both animals and humans, and that this leads to cardiovascular disease. This link down here is not rock solid in humans, but it is rock solid in animals. As one eats a lot of salt, it tends to wash calcium out of bones. The calcium goes through the kidneys, and high dietary sodium is associated with recurrent kidney stones, calcium-containing kidney stones, as well as osteoporosis. Now, high sodium is also a pro-inflammatory mutagenic agent and has been associated as a probable procarcinogen for gastric cancer, but in a variety of cohort studies has been shown to be associated with increased total cancer, but a variety of inflammatory diseases that you commonly will see in your practices. In addition, through other biomedical mechanisms, high salt, independent of the increase in blood pressure, can directly damage the heart and the kidneys. So I just want to make it clear that when certain dissenting scientists are speaking, there are no animal models where you add salt to their diets and good things happen to them. It's always diseases that do occur. If you feed some pregnant animals high salt, you can adversely affect the offspring with higher blood pressures as well. It's believed, and this again is mostly from animal research, that not all of the increase in blood pressure from salt is reversible. And so most of the human data that we have, we assume that all the blood pressure is reversible, but in some animal models, only part of the increase in blood pressure is reversible. And we believe that this is high sodium is an important factor in the increase in blood pressure with aging. Now, this is a systematic review that we conducted. This is 5 centimeters, these things down here. This amount of salt is what the average adult in Beijing eats. Now, if you were to consume a fair bit of salt acutely mixed in water or some other way, it would taste absolutely terrible. But if you were to consume about 4 tablespoons, some of you would die within a day. You would go into a coma, start seizing, and not survive. In children, eating just under 5 teaspoons a day can also cause acute fatalities, and that's related to the fact that the body cannot cope with the increase in sodium in the blood. So as we come back to the more chronic effects, this is a meta-analysis that was conducted under the auspices of the World Health Organization. They had a number of features to ensure that the studies were relevant. Number one, they had to actually reduce sodium. It had to be adequately assessed with a 24-hour urine. It had to be at least 4 weeks in duration. It had to be an intervention where they could actually disentangle the effects off the salt. And so quite a few randomized controlled trials, 37 in adults. The data was not as good in children, and they included some studies that didn't meet their own criteria. But there was a statistically significant reduction in blood pressure in the adults. It was greater in people with hypertension. It was greater the reduction in sodium, and was a linear dose response curve down to 1,200 milligrams per day. In children, the salt had a significant effect on their blood pressure, even though these are very young normotensive children in the studies. Now, those changes in blood pressure usually do not impress many clinicians, but they are the basis of the predicted reduction in cardiovascular disease that we would see, and I'll try to review some of that data for you. This is a dose response meta-analysis, just showing that there's steeper and greater reductions in blood pressure with greater reductions in dietary salt for both systolic and diastolic, that the relationship is not as steep in normotensives as it is in hypertensives. The higher the quality studies, the steeper the relationship was. This meta-analysis shows whether reductions in blood pressure were less than predicted or greater than predicted, and what you can see is studies need to be at least 4 weeks long to have a predicted reduction in blood pressure. And we do have a specialist who continues to do meta-analyses with most of the patients in 1 week or shorter duration studies showing less impact on blood pressure, and those are just poor designs. Now, this was an analysis that came out quite a while ago, and it really changed the way that I thought about public health. What it indicated was small reductions in blood pressure on a population basis can have a much greater impact on health than treating individuals with medications. And so the first was by Nancy Cook, where she showed reducing diastolic blood pressure by just 2 millimeters mercury. The amount you would expect from a small reduction in dietary salt would reduce cardiovascular disease more than treating all people with a diastolic above 95 with an antihypertensive drug. Now, we do know, and I'll talk about it in later talks tomorrow, that we're not doing that well in terms of treating the population with drugs. Reducing systolic blood pressure by about the same amount as you'd get with reducing dietary salt reduces death rates from stroke by about 14%, coronary heart disease by about 9%, and total mortality by about 7%. And the reason you get this large impact is it's spread across the whole population, not just a small grouping of people that we consider to be hypertensive. The World Health Organization went on to commission a meta-analysis of high-quality studies looking at the impact of different levels of sodium intake on cardiovascular disease. These had to be in healthy populations and had to be at least a year in duration, and they had 7 to 10 studies. Now, what I'd like you to note is the point estimates are always above 1, suggesting harm from sodium. In yellow are the ones that achieve statistical significance. So a relative risk of 1.2 for stroke, for fatal stroke of 1.6, and for coronary heart disease, fatal coronary heart disease of 1.3. So these are statistically significant findings. The findings were confirmed by 3 other meta-analyses of cohort studies of either healthy populations or that included quality filters to get rid of low quality studies. Now, looking at randomized control trials was a different group from the Cochrane group. The studies here, although they're randomized controlled trials, are not necessarily of great quality, and I think that's important to note. The other thing to note is that some of the data in this meta-analysis was from salt replacers. Salt replacers increase potassium while they're reducing sodium, and so you can get some of the benefits of potassium as well as removing some of the detriments of sodium by using them. Now, this is looking at lowering sodium, so the point estimates below 1 suggest a benefit of reducing sodium. And so you can see the point estimates, with the one exception, are all below 1, and that for total cardiovascular events, the relative risk was statistically significant, suggesting again a reduction in cardiovascular disease from reducing dietary sodium. We can look at what different countries have done, and the leading countries were Japan. There's not a lot of data from Japan, but what there is suggests they had a small reduction in population sodium consumption and a substantive reduction in stroke mortality. Data is better from Finland, which I'll show you, and the United Kingdom, but they're all consistent with reduction in sodium in populations, reducing cardiovascular disease. Now, a newer program is Korea, where they had a very marked, almost unbelievable reduction in dietary sodium in a period of 5 years, a 19% reduction. And they also saw a significant reduction in how much hypertension they had in their country. This is the UK data. And if we look at the top panel, we're looking at death rates from heart disease and from stroke. This middle panel is the population blood pressures in the UK, and the bottom panel is dietary salt. Now, these are very steep reductions in cardiovascular disease. I think it would be hard to attribute all of that to reduction in salt, but there was little other explanation for the improvement of population blood pressure. And so reductions in salt, reductions in blood pressure, and very substantive reductions in death from stroke and heart attack. When we look at Finland, I'm not sure if people are aware, but in the 1960s, in particular, men were dying in their 40s from cardiovascular disease. They had very high rates, with some people having heart attacks and strokes in their 30s even. They introduced a very comprehensive system to improve cardiovascular health, and reducing dietary sodium was one of the components. So over a long period of time, 30 years, this is about, you can see very large reductions in salt intake. In this panel here on your left, one can see very marked population reductions in blood pressure. These are huge reductions in population blood pressure. Note it's diastolic blood pressure. In the 1970s, people didn't think systolic blood pressure was a health risk. That's how old some of these studies are. In this panel here, you see stroke death, and about 60% of stroke is attributed to blood pressure. Now, when they analyzed the data, they felt most of the reduction in blood pressure was related to the reduction in dietary salt, and then they felt most of the reduction in stroke was related to the reduction in blood pressure. And so very consistent with what we would presume to be the case. Globally, every scientific and public health organization without commercial associations that have recommendations on dietary salt recommend that it's substantively reduced. The World Health Organization, less than 2,000 milligrams or 5 grams of salt a day. The other ones are relatively close to that. More recent recommendations, the dietary guidelines for the Americans, their scientific review was in 2015. They claim to have done a comprehensive systematic review of the literature, and that included the more recent controversial studies. Their conclusion was a healthy diet has little room for sodium, and they added saturated fat and sugars there as well. They suggested consuming no more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day, 5.8 grams a day, and that further reductions down to 1,500 milligrams a day would result in further reductions in blood pressure. In their opinion, also, reducing sodium by about 1,000 milligrams a day would reduce cardiovascular disease by about 30%. So again, modest reductions in sodium intake or salt intake, fairly substantive reductions in cardiovascular disease. Now, there is a problem with controversies, and we have a $4 trillion industry, one of the largest industries in the world. They are funding and promoting very low quality research, and they also fund and disseminate the information from dissident scientists. And so many dissident scientists who have contributed very heavily to the cardiovascular careers for their whole lives, if they get involved in SALT and become dissident, they'll have far more citations for the SALT work than they do for their more extensive work. And this undermines people's confidence in public health policy. And the current term for that is fake news, but there are better terms that people might want to use. Now, in my experience over maybe 12 years in dietary salt, I would question whether the science is controversial or the scientists are controversial. And in my experience, most of the dissenting scientists have commercial interests in either the salt industry or the food industry. In fact, when they were forced to disclose financial contributions from the tobacco industry, it turned out that individual had received $450,000 to $500,000 US for testifying in court that it was not proven that tobacco caused disease. They are also a SALT Institute consultant in the past. Often, even if you can get a disclosure of conflicts of interest, they aren't consistent in that disclosure. Now, some people will say, well, that's not science, that's just a problem, and it doesn't really affect the results that well. Well, the science of conflicts of interest is actually evolving. And in one set of research looking at meta-analyses on the impact of sugar on health, the odds ratio of an industry favorable result versus an unfavorable result was 7.61 when there was a conflict of interest with the authors and the industry. Now, you'll note that that odds ratio is much higher than the impact of, say, blood pressure on cardiovascular health. One of the things we note that many of the controversial studies are of very low quality. One of the most important things is the use of a single spot urine to estimate usual salt intake. Now we know that people will eat different amounts of salt each meal they take in, depending on what they're consuming a day, and that there's seasonal variation. A spot urine is asking someone to spontaneously void a sample into a container, and so it usually captures a relatively short period in time. If you were to eat salt, most of the salt that you eat is excreted within 6 hours. So this is really probably assessing what someone had in the meal before. So it's very, very unlikely to be strongly associated with long-term intake. We've also shown that just the formula by which someone converts sodium in a spot urine to a 24-hour urine can cause a change in the association with outcomes. Much of the work from these controversial scientists have errors in them. Some of them have altered a standard formula to make their data look better, and they don't disclose that. Meta-analyses weight it with short-term studies where the impacts of sodium are not clear. Findings that are not reproducible. And one of the main dissenting scientists published 4 cohort studies. 2 of them were redone using the same databases by other investigators with the opposite conclusions. One, his own group redid it later, and again, they could not reproduce the findings. In fact, found the opposite, that sodium was harmful. And then the fourth study has not been re-examined. Another controversy came from Italy, where a single investigator published 5 randomized controlled trials showing that low-salt diets were harmful in people with heart failure. It was noted in a meta-analysis of that data that some of the data from the different trials were identical. And the editors asked to see the original data to support how 2 different studies could produce identical data. All the data was lost in a computer failure. And so there's no data to actually confirm that individual's findings. A number of the controversial scientists in debates and in educational forums make false and misleading statements. One of the things that infuriates me is when I'm debating and the person debating me says it's a small number of people that support salt reduction. It's most of the global health and scientific organizations, including the World Health Organization, where the individual doing the debate is actually the small number of extremists. So one of the things to encourage you is there are regular systematic reviews of the impact of salt or sodium on health outcomes. These are published in the Journal of Clinical Hypertension every few months. Government organizations are regularly conducting reviews and producing dietary recommendations. And currently the Institute of Medicine is doing its review for Canada and the United States coming up. New Zealand and Australia just did their review and published it September last year. They indicated that adequate intake for sodium for an adult was 460 to 920 milligrams of sodium a day. This is really a very low amount. This is not really achievable if anyone's going to eat any processed foods. And recognizing that, they suggested a target for adults of about 2,000 milligrams a day. And even in today's context, that means really changing diets very, very substantively. There are a variety of organizations that have made a statement that they believe low-quality science is the source of controversies on dietary salt. And many of these organizations, plus others, are developing policy statements on the minimum criteria for research methods on salt. I'm involved in a particular project which reviews the literature weekly, and if anyone's interested in this, you can access it and sign up. It's a free subscription. These literature searches are summated together and critically appraised and published in the Journal of Clinical Hypertension, which is also available free of charge. And this is, I'm going to leave my slides behind, but if anyone would like a free access to the Journal of Clinical Hypertension, this is how you do so. It's the official journal of the World Hypertension League. So back to the start of the talk, this is could be fairly boring, but what it is essentially a call for you to take part in an important public health effort for Costa Rica to reduce the amount of salt in the foods. And so endorse and support the Costa Rican Declaration on Dietary Salt. Get involved in educating people on the health risks of dietary salt and how to reduce the intake. Get involved. Give presentations on dietary salt and encourage publications of articles on dietary salt. Advocate for media releases to bring information to the public, and this says in particular children and women, but being a man, I would like to be included there as well. Aid in broadly disseminating literature. Educate policymakers and decision makers about the health benefits. Advocate for policies and regulations. In my own medical school, I'm trying to encourage them to have healthier foods available on campus. advocate to the government and your politicians. And one of the nice things is that most politicians will have a doctor. So advocate to politicians and policymakers to introduce policies to reduce dietary salt. And in general, this is tough to do as individuals, and so I strongly promote coalition or work group formation to advocate. I think I've tried to go through some of what I believe are really the underbelly of the interaction between commercial enterprise, the food industry, and salt policy. I think this should be formally investigated. I don't think as a profession we should be tolerating this. What I say for salt is equally applicable to fats and sugars as well. And I'd just like to thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Adriana, what's the average salt intake of an adult in Costa Rica? 11.5 grams of salt. So you're up there. Now, I'm 4.6 grams of sodium, but so if you're looking at the WHO target, you're actually quite high. You've seen the different health risks that are involved in that. In most places, and I'm assuming in Costa Rica, people of your age will be at the peak, so you'll be higher than the population average. The intake's higher in males and females, and young adults are probably at the highest. And so this is probably not your blood pressure today, but this is probably your blood pressure in 15, 20 years when you're diagnosed with hypertension and someone starts you on treatment. On the other hand, advocacy and adequate policies now can keep you healthy. I don't know if you care about your parents. They'd probably keep your parents healthy too, but also future generations.
Sí funciona, que las dos últimas encuestas de riesgo que hace la Caja Costarricense de Seguros, que hace la Caja Costarricense, ha mostrado que la hipertensión arterial se mantiene a lo largo del tiempo, en los últimos 4 años, y por más esfuerzos que han hecho con drogas, con medicamentos, ¿verdad? No han tenido éxito. Entonces yo creo que justamente esa es una intervención, no va a ser la panacea, porque ya sabemos que la obesidad y otros factores de riesgo también influyen o intervienen en la presión alta, pero que hay que atacarla por otras vías, ¿verdad? Donde la parte de la alimentación yo creo que no ha sido como muy tomado en cuenta tan fuertemente en lo que es hipertensión arterial.
Just as an antidote, early in my career I used to do basic science and clinical research, but I became quite concerned that in Canada our control of hypertension was only 16%, and the United States, which does not have a very good healthcare system, was 25%. And so I was involved in organizing a program to improve the treatment of hypertension in Canada. And over about 6 years we were able to bring the control rate to 66%. The cost, just in terms of drugs, went from $750 million a year to $3 billion a year The number of physician visits for hypertension went from 10 million a year up to 25 million a year. Because hypertension goes up with age, we have close to half of women over age 60 on antihypertensive drugs, and the men are only a couple of percentage points behind. This seemed to be very wrong to be treating your whole population with drugs. We can actually measure antihypertensive drug levels in our rivers. You figure that one out. The fish will have lower blood pressure as a result of some of the things that we did. So we did some analyses on what it would take to try to reverse this. And essentially, if we were able to reduce dietary salt, about a third of the hypertension in Canada would have disappeared, and we would have saved all of the money that we spent on antihypertensive drugs and achieved a much higher control rate. And so those analyses were some of what convinced me to change tactics and really start to work on policies with our government to reduce the amount of salt they added. It seems that I'm certainly not the only one with that idea. But when it comes to country actions, it really takes people like yourselves to stand up and take leadership and to push for these things in your country. Otherwise, they just don't occur. And I think we're very lucky Adriana's here. Adriana was recognized with a Certificate of Excellence from the World Hypertension League for her advocacy in reducing dietary salt in Costa Rica, and also by a Woman of Impact Award from a Canadian organization, again for her efforts here. But this is really something that an individual cannot do. It's something that I think a medical school should become heavily involved in, and it would certainly be aided by your own personal efforts. And so I'm going to try to be funny here, and I'm not very funny, but and so the big difference is the color, and so and the cost, I should say. And so when you're buying these Himalayan salts or this salt or that salt, it's 95 to 99% sodium chloride, and what you're paying for is a little bit of color. There are salt alternatives. And so there's low salts where they'll put potassium and maybe some magnesium in. And those have been shown to be quite effective in terms of lowering blood pressure. If someone replaces the salt with something that's 40% potassium, the potassium helps lower the blood pressure, and reducing the amount of salt also lowers the blood pressure. And there are very large randomized controlled trials going on in China now where at least one has preliminarily reported a lower death rate in the people consuming the salt alternative again than just straight up table salt. And so there you go.
Why is so difficult to reduce salt in our countries? What is your opinion? I have mine, but I want yours.
It's really quite complex, and so there is a book called The World History of Salt, and it's about that thick, and I read it, but it took about a year, and it cured my insomnia. The issue is that salt has been intertwined with human history for a very, very long time. Before we had electricity and refrigeration, the only real way of preserving food was to salt it. Salt was a very rare commodity in those days, and so the word salary came from salt, because salt was so valuable. It was like gold today. When wars were fought, the salt mines and the sources of salt were the most strategic of military objectives. if you could not salt your food, you could not keep an army in battle because you could not feed it. And so there's this history, but salt was very, very rare. In China, the very, very rich committed suicide by eating salt, sort of as I sort of indicated there. If there was a person of honor coming to your dinner, you would put the salt shaker in front of their place because it signified their importance. Now, what happened was salt was very rare, but then as we commercialized the production of salt, it became ubiquitous and was put into all sorts of our foods and at very high levels. We now have refrigeration, which has removed most of the need for that salt, but we've also acquired a taste for the salt. Salt also has, I think, about 30 or 40 different sort of aspects to it that are important in terms of food processing. One of the things is just salt and water is very cheap now as opposed to being scarce and expensive before. And so if you buy a piece of meat, at least in Canada or the United States, they're all injected with salt water because the salt water is cheap and it keeps your meats plump and juicy. But salt will retain a lot of water, and so you're paying for essentially salt water, and so that's one of the commercial reasons. Another is it stimulates thirst, and so if someone's trying to sell you a beverage, that usually means a bar, they will give you salty food for free, usually because it means you're going to spend more at the bar drinking. But anyway, there's a whole variety of things. If you listen to this lecture and tomorrow you say, I'm swearing off salt, I'm going on a low salt diet, you will feel terrible. The food will taste bland, just absolutely awful, and you'll wonder, what the heck have I done? Well, if you're on a low salt diet and you have something that's very salty, it will taste terrible. And it takes multiple weeks to acclimatize to the taste. And so the secret of this with industry is to get them to do small changes. And if someone was to change your salt content of a particular food by less than 10%, you're not able to detect that. And yet you reset. And so what we're trying to do with industry is less than 10% changes, a series of steps. No one can tell the difference. But once they get old, fairly low, if they ate their previous food, they'd say, oh, that's terrible, it's very salty. But if you took someone who's up here and gave them food down here, they'd say, oh, that's terrible, it's bland, I don't like that. And so it's this gradual reduction in salt that is really unnoticeable, that what we're really trying to promote. Does that help? Absolutely, and so the ones that are currently successful on the health aspects are Japan, which was in the 1970s, where they had very, very high rates of salt intake and stroke, particularly in northern Japan. They didn't document their program very well, but it looks like they reduced intake by a couple of grams, and they had substantive reductions in blood pressure and stroke. Finland was the other one, and then the UK, and then the Finnish was a 30 to 40% reduction in salt intake, dramatic reductions in population blood pressure and stroke. And again, the data on the UK I showed you is positive. Those are the current success stories. Other countries are there's about 40 or 50 countries active in the world, but not at the stage where we can actually document. Yes, I'm so sorry. Most of the success stories are currently in high-income countries, as I indicated. In high-income countries, 75 to 80% of the salt consumed is from packaged foods and restaurants. And so what they did was, A, they determined what the population intake was, that it was very high, B, where it was coming from, and then C, what products. And then what they set was targets and timelines for different food categories to be achieved over time. So if a current food category was at 10, they would say in 2 years we want you to be to 9. And then 2 years after that down to 8, then 2 years. And so this very gradual reduction in the salt content. The successful programs have had strong political leadership. They've had, in general, strong advocates within the NGO community. Public campaigns. In Finland and in the UK, they had labels on foods that were clear. And so a warning label on the food in Finland. In the UK, many of the grocery stores have had a food wheel that has a red section. If the salt's too high, it also indicates sugars, calories, and saturated fats in that particular food wheel. Monitoring, very close monitoring, and so and it's public monitoring. So you could sit there and say this product is high in sodium from this company, and they haven't done anything, and then the government usually goes and talks to them. It's usually with the threat of regulation. This is voluntary unless you don't do it, in which case we'll regulate you. And so there's generally a carrot and a stick. For some industries, technical support, particularly small and medium businesses, may not have the technological expertise to do a full profile reformulation. So they take steps to help them as well. One of the reasons I was brought down was to try to encourage the academic community to get involved, because when the academic community is on board, consistent, and advocating, that's very helpful to the policymakers in making tough decisions, because in general the food industry is pushing back constantly at them. Does that help? And did I forget anything critical? Yeah, and so the consumer demand is a difficult thing, and in the UK they had SID the slug, and I wasn't aware at the time, but if you want to kill a slug you put salt on it. And so they had an ongoing public campaign. They have a very strong advocate, Graham McGregor, who almost every week will issue a media release that goes out saying, you know, this is the food category, and it's breads, and these are the ones that are very high and they're killing you, and these are the ones that are very good and you should buy those. And so every week he'll come out in the media with who's good, who's bad, and why it's important. And so you get a fairly well-informed consumer base. Part of the problem is when you talk to salt and the general public, some of them will perceive it negatively, that low-salt foods don't taste good. And that's because they may have tried something very high in salt and then something very low in salt. They didn't have that sort of time. And so a lot of us believe it should be done stealth, that it's not really public education that's important. It's really changing the food supply so it's a healthier food supply, so that someone doesn't have to go out and work hard to find something low sodium. Right now you buy anything, it's high in sodium. In the future it should be, you buy anything, it's low in sodium. If you want salt, get a shaker and, you know, put some on. That's excellent. I personally don't, but in countries, and I think Costa Rica is one of those countries where there's a fair bit of discretionary salt. The salt is added as salt itself, or is in different types of sauces or condiments. In those settings, education is fairly important. China is one of the leading countries in that, and the same Graham McGregor developed a school education program for China that significantly impacted the salt intake, not just of the child, but the child went home and educated the parents, and so the whole family's salt intake went down with that particular maneuver. But you do bring up the fact that education is more important where discretionary salt is involved. But we also believe in that situation having low salt salts, the potassium replacers available, and in the condiments you can see wide ranges of salt. So you can get a soya salt that has 10% of the salt of an ordinary soya sauce, and so even there you can make heavy inroads on salt intake by sort of policies and targets and timelines. Yes, and so obesity is a salt-sensitive condition, and so reducing salt in an obese individual will lower their blood pressure and will make them more sensitive to a number of antihypertensive drugs in addition to that. But you know, as physicians, we would be trying to you know, get them to increase their physical activity, increase fruits and vegetables so their potassium goes up, and some weight reduction in addition to salt. Salt would be one of the components that one would work at in terms of lifestyle behavior. I've sort of told you the story of salt, but there's other stories to be told in hypertension prevention as well. Absolutely, and I apologize because I should have had that here. There's been decades-long efforts to reduce iodine deficiency that have been quite successful in the Americas, and the way iodine deficiency has been combated is by iodizing salt. Now, it's important that that program is monitored by how much iodine goes in, and that's by how much iodine goes out in the urine. And so what can be done and what's recommended to be done is to monitor salt intake and iodine intake together in the urine and to coordinate the programs. And so if salt is going down, you can be very, very proud and happy that you're improving public health. But what you do is just add more iodine to the salt, and that's technically very feasible. And so coordinating the two programs is important, but they're both important public health issues. They can both be dealt with together to improve public health. They're technically very compatible.
I want to add something about the country. When we prepared the National Plan for Salt Reduction, it is for 10 years, we included monitoring of iodine and fluoride. And also, para que le entiendas, si no es como te lo dejo afuera, ¿verdad? Hablo mejor en español, pero bueno, lo que quiero decir es que lo agregamos en el plan de trabajo, el monitoreo de ambos. Cuando establecimos la meta de reducción de sodio en la Estrategia Nacional de Abordaje de las Enfermedades No Transmisibles, que se puso que es un 15% del valor que teníamos en ese momento como basal de reducción al 2020, nos dimos cuenta, con ayuda de un asesor, el doctor Omar Dari, que es un especialista en fortificación de la sal, que hay una sobredosis de yodo. La gente está expuesta a mucho yodo en este país con la sal. La dosis que se estimó está estimada para un consumo de 10 gramos de sal de mesa. Y lo que nosotros estimamos con el estudio de nosotros, si solo estimamos sal de mesa, son 7 gramos. O sea, y se puede bajar durante, si logramos bajar, tenemos chance de no tener ningún riesgo por mucho tiempo de afectar en cuanto a llenar las recomendaciones de yodo. Entonces, más bien, hemos tenido el caso de gente que se nos ha acercado, médicos endocrinos, con pacientes con problemas de tiroides y de todo, que tienen que ver con todo este exceso de yodo y una preocupación, que es otra área de trabajo, ¿verdad?, que no se ha hecho, del sobreconsumo de yodo, y eso no es solo Costa Rica, eso es en general Centroamérica, hay un exceso de yodo.
Yeah, and so the question is sodium in diabetic patients, and again, diabetes, similar to obesity, is a salt-sensitive condition. When you lower dietary salt, you're concerned about stimulating the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis with increasing glomerular pressures and increased proteinuria. In acute reductions in dietary salt, that may be borne out. In longer-term studies, there's no impact on the renin-angiotensin system of reducing dietary salt. Those are studies longer than 6 weeks in a meta-analysis. And in the studies where they've looked at proteinuria, on average there's a reduction in proteinuria as opposed to an increase in proteinuria with salt reduction. But the other thing that happens is you can markedly accentuate the hypotensive effects of things like ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers, and so that could be viewed as a benefit either by lowering the dose and the cost, or by just lower pressures with the same dose. I should say that one of the cohort studies, it was a relatively well done cohort study, found an increase in death with lower salt in people with diabetes. The understanding of most of us is that that's due to reverse causality, where the people who are sicker were probably eating less salt and dying more often. But there are other plausible explanations there. But that's one of those controversial areas, but is probably due to other methodology. I think the scientist who performed that particular study is a good scientist without conflicts of interest. Muchas gracias. That's the few Spanish words I know.